Morgan has, yeah, okay. Morgan has taken what they call STAR, or Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience Training at the Eastern Mennonite University, and is actively involved with a project called Coming to the Table, an organization that promotes linkages between the descendants of enslaved people and the families that enslaved them for the purpose of healing from the trauma of slavery. Sharon is the co-author of the book, Gather at the Table, The Healing Journey of a Daughter of Slavery and a Son of the Slave Trade. And I'll just add my little 2 cents worth, because I went on Amazon a week or 2 ago when I knew I was going to introduce her, and got a copy of the book. And it is a compelling read, along with the, I guess I would call it the companion book that was written by her co-author, Thomas DeWolf, called Inheriting the Trade. So I started with Inheriting the Trade because it came right off my Kindle, but I wanted a hard copy of her book, because I want to review it for my book club. And it was an eye-opening, fascinating journey, and I mean, it really, for me, was an eye-opening journey into what privilege we inherit. And it was very thought-provoking. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Sharon. And if anyone wants to come up and leaf through the book, or maybe I will just pass it around, and if you guys can make sure that it doesn't leave the room, because I need it for a book review. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. I am going to, our topic today is healing historical harm. So I'm going to do this presentation, and then I have allowed plenty of time afterwards. So as was said, please hold your questions until later. You can put them up on the chat, and then I will be able to see what you are asking. So healing historical harm. This is me. I'm a writer and genealogist, and these are 4 significant books that are important to me. One is Gather at the Table, which you have read. Then there's a little book of racial healing. And then there's a book called Slavery's Descendants, to which I contributed. And next month, the book Finding Your Family Tree, which is a basic guide to how to do genealogy, will be coming out and available on Amazon and everywhere else. So that's the one I'm kind of most proud of right now, because it's the new book. So why am I a genealogist? My son was born in 1969 when I was 18 years old. So I was a very young person. But when he was born, I really thought about, where did we come from? And I didn't have a lot of information about that. In the course of pursuing my interest in finding out who we were and where we came from, I eventually learned that my great-grandparents were enslaved in Alabama. And that harkened back to an old woman who I used to go with my mother to visit when I was a baby. And I found out that she had been enslaved. She was alive when I was a small child. She died at the age of 104 in 1954 when I was 3 years old. But what that brought home to me is that slavery is not a distant memory. It is something that the remnants of it existed in my lifetime. I was fortunate to have married a man from Alabama, and that gave me access for research because I used to go to Alabama a lot. And I thereafter spent a lifetime, as I am still doing, researching my roots. And my goal in doing all this is to leave a legacy for the future. From what I have learned and what I've experienced, it is very important to me to leave behind not just my family story, but how genealogy can be a tool for healing. So genealogy is important because it brings your family tree to life. People do the research, and a lot of them just they collect the names and the date and the place. What I really strive to do is to humanize them, to kind of bring them back to life, because I want their stories. And I wish photography had been invented long before it was, because I would love to see who these people are. Genealogy helps you to understand and appreciate who you are, because you came from somewhere, somebody, and it enables you to find and embrace lost family. I have found so many cousins that I never knew I had because of my research. It also teaches you research skills. It teaches you to be more disciplined and more organized in doing the research, and that kind of applies to other things in your life. It enhances your self-esteem, because when you realize the hard times that people had to endure in order for you to be here, it really makes you feel very proud of being who you are. And it helps heal the wounds of the past. So, historical harm. America has two original sins, if you will. And those are 400 years of Native American genocide and 245 years of African slavery. I focus on the African research, so I'm going to talk mostly about that. So the transatlantic slave trade endured for 4 centuries. More than 12 million people were stolen from Africa, and many of them never made it farther than the Atlantic Ocean. 3+ million people perished in the Middle Passage, which is the route that took people out of Africa and into the places where they were enslaved. Countless more died in wars and raids that were connected to the trade. The triangular trade connected the economies of 4 continents: Europe, Africa, North and South America, and all of the islands in between. The end result, you see the map here, which shows you the route. The slave trade built the economy of the entire Western world, and that is something that people really don't want to acknowledge. So that's part of what we want to bring to light. Enslaved people, 500,000 Middle Passage survivors were enslaved in North America. That was kind of a shocking number to me, because if you have 12 million people who were kidnapped, what happened to the rest of them? So most of them actually went to South America. 500,000 ended up enslaved in North America. In 1860, 4 million people, those 500,000, turned into 4 million people who were emancipated by the Civil War. In 1860, only 250,000 of those 4 million people were classified as free. Today, the African American population is 42 million people. So there's a huge community of people who really want to know where they came from and how all this happened. The peculiar institution. American slavery, North American slavery, was really unique, and it is actually documented in historical accounts as a peculiar institution, because slaves were defined as chattel. Chattel was property, not human beings. So people who were enslaved, Black people who were enslaved, were defined like the cows and the pigs and the other livestock, and not as human beings. And that is part of the travesty of what we're dealing with here. Slaves were held against their will from the time of capture, purchase, or birth, and they were deprived of their right. They couldn't leave, they couldn't refuse to work, and they never received any compensation for their labor. Enslavement was permanent. It was not something that you could get out of. Slavery has always existed, and it has had different permutations. But part of the peculiar institution was that slavery here was permanent. It was generational. Children were enslaved based on the status of their mother. The European standard when you do genealogical research is that family lines follow the male. That paradigm was upended because slaveholders wanted to be able to enjoy the labor of the mother as well as her increase meaning her children. So slavery was generational. If my great-grandmother was enslaved, her children would be enslaved, everybody succeeding her would be enslaved. And then slavery dehumanized an entire race of people that was purely based on the, quote, color of their skin. Disregard the color of my skin permanently, but the point was that anyone who was Black would be enslaved. The enslavers, and this may be shocking to some, in 1860, 394,000 people held 4 million people in bondage. 1 in 70 people were slaveholders. The average slaveholding was 10 people. The owners of 200 or more slaves was less than 1% of the total, but they held 20 to 30% of everyone who was enslaved. Over 80% of free adult males in the South did not own slaves. And for white researchers that I work with, that often induces a sigh of relief because they are happy when they find out that their family didn't own slaves. Most slaveholders were Scots-Irish. Okay, now this is a big deal over here. 49%, half of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention were slave owners, and 12 of the first 18 American presidents were slaves, several of them during the time that they were in office. So slavery was just so embedded in the American system that it is mind-boggling. How did they do this? How did America establish this marvelous democracy that we all feel very patriotic about? It is because of cognitive dissonance. You can hold 2 conflicting points of view in your head. So an example, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was having children with his wife's half-sister. And he did not, he held the prevailing point of view about Black people being less than, but he still did that. And so how do you write a Declaration of Independence for everybody and then still be able to hold slaves? So that is called cognitive dissonance. It is 2 different uncomfortable points of view, and how do you resolve those? There is also the idea of complicity. So you have, there are people did not, even if they were not slaveholders, they were complicit because slavery was the primary driver of American economic development, and it was the primary source of American wealth. So even if you don't participate as a slaveholder, you are still complicit because you are participating in a system that is being motivated, financed by the system of slavery. So all of America, North and South, were complicit in building and sharing the wealth that was generated by slavery. People in the North often vilified the South because that's where it's happening, but it is not. The entire country was complicit. There were 2 versions of the 2, I don't say, I want to say versions, 2 iterations of the slave trade. One was the importation of people who were brought directly from Africa. In 1808, the importation of people was outlawed by American law, but now what do we do as slaveholders? So there was a second wave that is called the domestic slave trade, where 1.2 million people were displaced from Atlantic states to the deep South. As America grew and moved westward, there was a continuing demand for slave labor, and therefore we enter into a period when people were being bred to have more slaves so that they could work these cotton fields and to continue to contribute to the wealth of slaveholders. Richmond, Virginia was the center of the domestic slave trade. So from 1830 to 1860, that was the nexus of where that occurred. Once there was a civil war, and man, I can't even have enough slides for that one. The Civil War was about maintaining an economic system that was based on slavery. And here's where class kind of comes into it, because you have rich slaveholders who used young men to fight this war so that they could stay rich. Once slavery was ended in 1865, there was a period of Reconstruction, plus minus 10 years, which was an attempt to recover from the Civil War and an attempt to redress the political, social, and economic inequities of slavery. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established. Schools like Tuskegee Institute were established. Black people were allowed to vote, and they were actually successfully elected to political offices throughout the South. And there were very serious discussions about reparations. There was a lot of kickback on whether or not this was a good thing, but it did happen, and it was like a bright spot in the history. After enslavement, it's like, what happens? People were turned out on the road and just with nothing. So how do you redress this? So Reconstruction was an attempt to make things right. But then you have Reconstruction, and then you have this system of people came out of slavery, and plantations were divided into plots, and sharecropping became the next big thing. And that was basically another form of slavery. Former slaves worked for subsistent farms on the same land and for the same masters who had enslaved them. In exchange for the land, living quarters, and supplies, sharecroppers raised cash crops, usually cotton, and half of it went to their landlords. It was just a new form of economic dependence and poverty. It was just a new iteration of slavery, basically. Then there's Jim Crow. So racial segregation laws circumscribed the lives and ambitions of African Americans for more than 100 years, from the mid-1850s all the way through Reconstruction and thereafter. There was an attempt to keep the races separate and to keep Black people who had been formerly enslaved in subjugation. So we have the Ku Klux Klan, we have, the black and white water fountains, we have the civil rights riots. I mean, it's like 100 years of, we're still trying to get over slavery, and how do we do that? So Jim Crow that's the name that is given to this period in time. Lynching during this time was horrific. From 1882 to 1951, 4,730 people were lynched. Most of them were Black. There was an anti-lynching campaign that was led by African American organizations, and it was minimally successful. The resource that I have given, there is an amazing memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, that if you ever have an opportunity to go there, it is well worth it, because it documents the strange fruit. And that name is drawn from a song that was popularized by Billie Holiday, an African-American jazz singer. and it's strange fruit that's hanging from the poplar trees. There are several instances of lynching that actually are recorded all the way to 1988 and even beyond. There have been instances of lynching even in the 2000s. Peonage. When sharecropping, it worked really well, but some people weren't sharecroppers. So we have another period of peonage, and it's called debt slavery. So what would happen is that Black men, women, and children would be enslaved again by being sent to jail and forced to work. This book, Slavery by Another Name, documents the peonage system. The coal mines, steel companies, they used enslaved labor, and slavery is still legal for people who are incarcerated. So this is not something that has gone away. It is something that continues to exist today. The slavery in general is illegal unless you are incarcerated. And that still exists. And I know that that's shocking. It was shocking to me. So in response to all of these things that happened, slavery, Jim Crow, peonage, sharecropping, there was a great migration of Black people. More than 7 million African Americans migrated out of the South, and they moved to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. And there were two waves of it. So the first wave was from 1916 to 1930. The second wave was from 1940 to 1970. And presently, there's sort of a reverse migration in progress. So from 2005 to 2010, 300,000 Black people moved south. So we are coming back and reclaiming. But the Great Migration was one of the largest movements of human beings from one place to another that has ever happened historically. So out of all of this, what do we get? The African American experience is filled with so many examples of horrible things. Kidnapping, being kidnapped from Africa, being enslaved, being raped, being tortured, the destruction of our families, unimaginable cruelty, the breeding that went on when I talked about the domestic slave trade, medical experimentation, sterilizing people, lynching, criminalizing them and sending them to jail and forcing them to endure debt peonage, and then generally disenfranchisement. So what does that do to your brain? This book is incredible, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and it talks about what happens. How did people endure this? And how does that inform how we live our lives today? And it was really ironic because I ran into Joy DeGruy, who wrote this book, in the airport yesterday. And it's still true, and this book is well worth reading. The global consequences of slavery is that during the transatlantic slave trade, the entire continent of Africa was depopulated. Without slavery, their 1850 population would have doubled. The able-bodied people were removed in the 18 to 40-year-old age group. So they totally upended the ability of Africa to develop in a way that they should. Today's poorest countries in Africa are those from which the most slaves were taken. Global consequence in Europe and the Americas is that contemporary economic wealth, it is tangible evidence of economies that were built on slavery because they got a leg up. The United States benefited tremendously from getting free land, free labor, and the ability to increase European wealth for people of European descent. We exist now in a system where there are disparities in every key indicator of social well-being. So in economics, there's a wealth gap, unemployment, poverty, health, our lifespans. We live shorter than white people do. Our infant mortality rates are greater. Educational results are different. There's a huge amount of violence in our families and communities, and incarceration is incredible. Black people are 13% of the population, but 65% of prisoners in penal institutions. The elephant in the room is that belief in European superiority is what fueled the genocide of Native Americans and slavery of Africans. And it generated a pernicious system that continues to enthrall. So our society is defined by these currents of thought and cognitive dissonance that make it almost automatic that people will be racist and that people will not be able to form relationships that are based on equality. So we have, and that is the division and hate that we are living with. So we have crime, and I'm looking at this picture of Dylan Roof, who walked into a church and massacred the people there after he prayed with them. How could anyone do something like that? But the system we live in has engendered this current of violence that is just horrific. And, so how do we change that? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So the way that I came to this is from my family story. So I'm going to share with you about a short version of my family and how these things have affected me personally. And a lot of it you'll read in the Gather at the Table book. But here's a little bit more. So this is my family tree. You see me, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. All of my great-grandparents were actually enslaved, and many of them were fathered by white men who I've been looking for. On the paternal side, my maiden name is Leslie. So Tom, Leslie, and Rhoda Reeves were born into slavery around 1850. They were enslaved in Lowndes County, Alabama. They moved to Opelika after the Civil War. They were able to marry in 1871 and started a family. And by 1890, they were living in Montgomery, where my father was born. My father was part of the Great Migration, and he never went back to Montgomery, and he never wanted to talk about it. And it took years for me to get him to open up. On my mother's side, the family names are Gavin and Nicholson. So my great-great-grandmother is Betty Wharf, who was born into slavery around 1840. She was purchased as a 9-year-old child and transported to Mississippi. She was enslaved by a man named Alan Gavin, and she ended up having 17 children with his nephew, Robert Gavin. So her daughter married a Nicholson, and that's the branch that I come from. I have spent my life of research tracking those 17 children and trying to figure out where did they go, who were they, and putting Betty's story together. I am presently working on a book about her. The working title is The Betty Book, because I'd really like to understand. She had 17 children with somebody, and she had no agency. She could not say no. So that's sort of 17 instances of her being raped. So in my big family picture, I have more than a dozen people who were enslaved on both sides, and I've listed their names on the right side of the screen. Those are the names I have been able to find. And one of the things that is important to me is that when you do the research, you find the names and you announce them out loud, because that is a way to recognize people who were once ticks on a slave schedule with no names. So it's really important to me to make sure their names are known. One of the things that is really important as you do your genealogical research is realizing how important oral history is. So you will have a family story, and many of them are fabrications of, things that make you feel good, but there's always a grain of truth. So you really have to start with the stories in your family, interview your oldest relatives, and that will lead you to whatever the truth is, because there's always a grain in there. That's how I started, and that is what has worked for me. The primary thing that genealogists use when they start their research are the federal censuses, because they were taken every 10 years beginning in 1790, and the latest census that was released to the public after 1940. Prior to 1870, Black people are not in these censuses. They are on slave schedules, but there are no names. So if you're doing African-American research, your key document is looking for the 1870 census and try to find your person. By 1880, many African-Americans had moved and maybe changed their names. And just know that many African-Americans did not participate in the system, either because they were in rural locations or they were in fear of being identified. But using the censuses to track your family is the best thing to start with. Then we have the slave schedules. So in 1850 and 1860, there were separate schedules that are useful, but there are no names. So you can only piece it together through logic. So my example is that Tom Leslie, my paternal ancestor, his mother, Harriet, was enslaved by a man named Dr. John Marast. And in 1850, Dr. Marast owned 104 people. Where is my great-great-grandmother on that list? I can only deduce by logic to figure out that she is one of those people. Then there are state censuses, which are also helpful, but all states do not have censuses all the time. So those are useful to look at because they cover the period. 10 years is a long time. A lot can happen. So the state censuses help fill in those blanks. Most of the southern states conducted a local enumeration in 1866 after the Civil War. So that one is particularly important. So the items you see in yellow, that's my family. And I found them in 1866 in Lowndes County. Birth records are the next big thing. The problem is most states did not require birth records until 1912. So many people born before 1900 do not have birth certificates. And most people were born at home and they were delivered by midwives. So there's another big gap there. But all birth, BMD stands for birth, marriage, and death records at the county level. And you try to find birth records. So that's my father's birth record. He was born in 1914 in Montgomery, Alabama. When you get these records, they will tell you the names of the parents. So that's what's important because it takes you back another generation. Marriage records are another one. That's a big event in your life. So these are important. For people who were enslaved, it was illegal to be married. And therefore, many of them were not able to officiate their status until after emancipation. So this is my great-grandparents, Tom Leslie and Rhoda Reeves, and their marriage record at Opelika. Death records. These are wonderful because they take you back another generation. And every state, they all look different. But these are useful. And just remember that birth and death records were not recorded generally until after 1912. So there's a dearth there. Marriage records are pretty easy to find, except for Black people. But these are just examples of what you will find. And ideally, you read every document very carefully You want to know if there's a parent listed, and you look at the informant, because that could be a person who is related. Military records. These are important because everybody had to register for, this is a World War I registration. What is interesting about this, you see on the bottom where the corners are cut off, when people registered, the way that they would tell that a person was Black without saying that out loud was to cut off the corner of the certificate so that it would identify people who were Black. White people's cards do not look like that. They don't have that corner cut off. So that's another one of those systemic things that we're not usually aware of. For Black people, we didn't get a lot of coverage in newspapers. So our way of being able to do our research is funeral programs. So this is the one for my father. And these are really useful, and there are efforts where people are collecting these for their communities, but these are vitally important because they help pull together families and identify people that you may not have known. And then newspapers. On the left there is my mother, and she was in the Pittsburgh Courier as a pinup girl, basically. And newspapers are really good. Unfortunately, for Black people, most of the information that was in a newspaper would be something that was not good. So on the right, you see an account of a murder by former slaves against the people who had owned them. And so you get like a bad story. So those are the ones you usually get. And then the one in the middle is a grand uncle of mine who fled Mississippi during the Great Migration, went to Oklahoma, and ended up in Iowa, where he blew his brains out. Photograph. Photography was not commonly available until the 1850s, and they were a great luxury for poor people. But man, if I could have pictures of people that were born before 1850, that would be astonishing to me. This is part of my family. They were in Oklahoma. This picture was taken around 1910, and it just enables you to see, what did they look like? How tall were they? I mean, you know, it's like, what was the look on their face? And so the photographs are very good, but there were no selfies. So that was new. There are special challenges for African-American research, largely to do with the lack of availability of records. So poor people were not well documented. Poor people in general, whether you're Black or white, poor people were not well documented. For Black people, we were, like I said earlier, prior to 1870, we were in records for property rather than people. There are also fluid surnames where people would change their names. In 1870, you might have the name of your slaveholder. In 1880, you might have decided you wanted a different name. Then you have geographic movement because you don't know where people were. The census is 10 years apart, so people moved around quite a bit. Then there are non-married partnerships where people would have cohabitated or been involved, but that's not documented as a marriage. And then you have fictive relationships where in a lot of cases, because our families were sundered, Black people had a lot of adopted relatives, where like I had an aunt, Drusilla. She had nothing to do with me biologically, but she was my aunt, so that's fictive. And then so many siblings and other family members were lost. I have no idea if my great-grandparents had brothers and sisters because there's just no record of that. And I believe they must have, because slavery encouraged enslaved women to have children, but what happened to those children? And then you have the unmarked graves where people were buried, but you have no idea where they were. Another big challenge is the surnames. before 1870, most enslaved people did not have a public surname. Like I said, they were typically identified by the surname of their owner. Many changed their names after emancipation, and related family members could take different names. So you can have somebody Smith, Jones, Johnson, I mean, whatever, all in one family. So it takes a lot of research and work to connect them. It is estimated that 15% of African Americans took the surname of the slave owner. And that's not proven, but you could have any name that you wanted. The one thing that is for sure is that African Americans did not depart from Africa with European names, first or last. So just remember that. For Native Americans, that's a whole new branch of research. If you are attempting to research your family to decide whether or not they were Native American, the signal thing is the Dawes Commission that operated for more than a decade, that was set up by the government, and it was established in order for the government, the federal government, to decide who was Indian. Note that it was not left up to the actual Indian tribe to decide that. And the federal government did it so that they could do land allotments. They changed the entire system for how land was allotted, because Native American tribes typically held land in community with one another, and they didn't have individual land. So the Dawes Commission changed that. It either accepted or rejected you. And if you were accepted, you could get a land allotment, and it was your own private land. So how do you find these slave? You start in 1870 and you try to find your ancestor there and see who is in the household. Then you try to track them to 1880 and see there will be new people in the household. But that's how when I said earlier, how you use the census to track people. So 1870 is the signal moment, because that is when we are accounted for as people with surnames. And then you follow that path, 1870, 1880, the 1890 census was mostly burned up. So we don't have that, but then you do 1900, 1910, and you keep going forward. And it's very tedious, but it works. If you want to find the slaveholder, you look for your ancestor, your Black ancestor in 1870. And then you look several households forward, preceding pages, and succeeding pages. And if you go 10 up and 10 down, and you find a white person with the same surname, that is your likely slaveholder. And that's called the Nettie rule. And it really works. It sounds really simplistic, but it really does work. Chancery court records are really important because deeds document property transactions, and because we were not people, we were property. You will find many deeds that will show you where people have been bought, sold, exchanged in other ways. So these are examples of deeds and estate files. When somebody died, there was a probate process. And then that is another place where you will find names of enslaved people. And then personal papers. So a lot of these papers, some families kept really good records and others did not. But this particular one, it shows you like a coffin for a Negro child. There's no name for the child, but at least it gives you some kind of perspective on what was happening on that plantation and what they were spending money on. Then you have land records, which are important because, like they say, follow the money. So in America, you follow the land. So as I'm looking at the white and slaveholder Gavin in Mississippi, they arrived in America around 1700, and they were indentured servants, and they got a land grant. And that got them started on the path to prosperity. You had head rights, you had people who served in the military and therefore got land grants. So the land records are really important in tracking the family and being able to decide if someone had land that was bigger than one family could work. A family could work like 10 acres, probably easily, if they had children. If you get beyond that, then they probably were slaveholders, because there's no way one family can work 1,000 acres. So when you're looking to find descendants, you choose a start person, and then you search their names on the censuses all the way through 1940, and you try to find recent documents like death certificates, and then you try to locate living people. So across the bottom here are several people that I found in the course of my research on my 2 times great-grandmother, who had 17 children. So these are all descendants of them. They live in Virginia, Arizona, Illinois, Florida, Missouri. I mean, they're all over the place, and they look black and white, and you don't know. But that can be really helpful, because several of these people they were doing their own research and contributed to my being able to build out my family tree. So the last big topic is DNA testing, because it is amazing that it proves beyond doubt who you're related to and where your family originated. So my 2 times great-grandmother, my DNA testing indicated that she came from the Makua tribe, which is prevalent in East Africa. My Nicholson ancestors, the root there is Mandinka, which is West Africa. And then the slaveholders, a large percentage of my family DNA is Scots. So these were Scotsmen who came from Scotland. There are 3 types of tests. One is Y-DNA, which is father to son, so it follows a direct male line. So if you want, I advise that you try to use DNA to solve specific problems. So if you want to know who the fathers were, you want Y-DNA. So I kept researching my Tom Leslie, my father's grandfather, who was his father. And I finally got a match late last year that it was nobody that I thought that he was. But it is a firm match, and that is father to son, and we cannot argue it. Then you have mtDNA, which is mother to daughter, and that's again direct, so woman, woman, woman. And then you have the atDNA, which is autosomal, which is the popular test that everyone is taking, and that accounts for both sides, but it's harder to figure out what those tests mean, because they cover so much territory, both sides. So what you want to do if you want to test somebody is that you want to try to solve your puzzle. I think that it is really useful to do as many tests as you can for your older relatives before they pass, because at least you'll have a bank of tests to have on hand to see what happens later. You don't test children whose parents have both tested, because that's redundant. And you don't test multiple Y-DNA or mtDNA on the same line, because again, that is redundant. You want to answer specific questions, so you have to be really selective about what you choose. Epigenetics. This is a study of how past trauma informs us today. So the things that our forebears experienced, they are never gone. They leave scars on your DNA. And this has been proven. So Africans who survived slavery, Jews who endured the Holocaust, Chinese whose grandparents experienced the Cultural Revolution, there are markers on their DNA that they pass on to their children. But what is important to know is that our history is not our destiny. Even though that marker is there, that this happened and it was traumatic and it informs my behavior, I can consciously change that so future generations don't have to endure the same thing. So from trauma to transformation, I went on a healing journey because I had all history. I was very angry, trying to figure out what to do with it. So I wrote this book, Gather at the Table with Tom DeWolf. His family were the largest slave traders in American history. And we connected and we're trying to prove this model of how do you heal. So there are cycles of violence that people go through where the cycle is that like abused people often abuse people. And what you want to do is consciously get out of these cycles so that you are not exhibiting the same behavior that was presented before. So we are both involved with a group called Coming to the Table, which is designed to take America beyond the legacy of enslavement. And there is a system for how you deal with historic harm and how you address the trauma and change to do something different. You also have to consider restorative justice. What we're looking for in this process is that we are attempting to restore a balanced relationship between people. And you have to have everybody participate. So who was hurt? What was the cause? What do both parties need? So white men were the slaveholders, Black people were the enslaved people. All those voices need to be heard in order for this to be restorative and to make a change. And then there's a big conversation, especially now, about reparations. That is worth looking into because everybody else has received reparations except Black people. And there is a House Bill 40 that has been presented every year since 1989 and has never been approved. So that is one thing that needs to happen. It is still alive. It is still being presented every year. And that is something that needs to be addressed. In the end, my goal is to create a new legacy. This is my family. That is my son, my daughter-in-law, and my 2 grandkids. We need to share our findings. We need to preserve the research for future generations. And we really need to work with our families, with ourselves, to change the paradigm. So my way of changing the paradigm is that I moved to Mississippi to write a book about my 2 times great-grandmother. And I have reclaimed my roots here. And it has been an incredible experience doing this and trying to write this book, which I'm not finished with yet. So here are some resources that you can use. I urge everyone to watch 12 Years a Slave. It is very difficult to watch, but it is really meaningful. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, I think that is really important because it tells the impact of what happened in the African-American psyche and adjusting to what happened to us. And the history of white people, it's like, what happened on that side? So anyway, just look at the list. They are really useful things. They have always been to me, and I think they will be useful to others. And now we can talk. So that is the end of the presentation, and let me know what I'm supposed to do next.
Yeah.
Well, I got some applause over here from Tom.
Yes, there's some applause. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Sharon? Cheryl, you have someone with a question.
Okay, good. What is that question? Should I look at the chat? Should I look at the chat or they're gonna talk?
I'm adopted, so I have a little bit more of, I guess, time. I don't know who my birth parents were or any of that. So where do I start?
As an adopted person?
Yes.
Okay, that research is really difficult to do because adoption records were and are in many states closed. but there is an effort to open those records. And I'm not going to remember the name of the website, but there is a national registry for people who were adopted. You can sign into the registry, and if your birth parents are looking for you, they will sign in and you will then be able to connect. That is, I'm not an expert on that topic, but I know several people who have actually been able to connect. I had a foster child, and I used that registry in order to find her mother. And it ended up that her mother was looking for her just like she was looking for her mother. And so I know that it does work. The other is that you can do DNA testing, and this has worked for a lot of people, where if you do the DNA, you do the autosomal, that's the test that covers both sides, and see what matches you come up with there. And a lot of people have had success with that.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any hands go up. So thank
One right there.
Okay.
That either means that I answered everything. or-
No, we have another hand.
Yes, I've been doing my family history, and it's all the ancestors' family search. I could only go back to 1825. And I'm at a standstill. Where do I go from there?
At 1825,
Right.
are you researching African Americans or?
But yes, I'm an African American.
Okay, your answers will probably lie in estate files, wills, deeds. You will look for your family name in the county where you know your family lived, and see if you can come up with. It is likely that there were only 10% of Black people were free. So 90% of us were enslaved. So you want to find the slaveholder, and you need the slaveholder records. And those would likely be found in the courthouse. And this will sound really awful, but you need families where people died before 1865, so that their probate records will have lists of names of people who were enslaved.
Okay, we're talking slaves or slaveholders before 18.
Yeah, but you reach a point where you really have to look at the slaveholder, because remember, we're not people, we're property.
Right.
So you will find a will that will list, I am bequeathing Susie to my daughter Mary. Or you will find an estate file that has an inventory of all the people that person enslaved. So
Thank you.
those will be that'll be your sweet spot for research.
Thank you very much.
We got one.
Okay, are there what other questions do you have? Here's another question.
Hi, I'm just curious if you suspect that there may be people who come from the islands and didn't necessarily come directly through the south of the US. Is the research and angle the same to find those records?
The process is basically the same, and it is very common that there are families with roots on the various Caribbean islands, hugely in the United States. People came from Barbados, and they have some very decent records to be able to do the research. But again, you have to trace the slaveholder and see what their migration path was. And then there is also the colonial, what is it called? The Colonial Register of Dependencies, and that is slave records for all of the English-speaking islands. So those went online a few years back. And it was kind of shocking to everybody because every member of parliament in Britain had ancestors who enslaved people. But yes, that is common. That is a common path. And you just have to get back to where's the root Caribbean community. And many of them do have genealogy societies. It is for my website, Our Black Ancestry. I frequently, there are sections that tell you where to go for island research and even African research, so that you can, I list links. I don't have the actual documents, but at least I provide links for this is where you go if you're looking for Barbados. So here are the resources for that. So you might want to look at the ourblackancestry.com website. You have to be a member to get that part of it, but it is very useful. You can also join, Our Black Ancestry has a Facebook page that has 36,000 people on it. And it is a peer research community. So if you are looking for specific information about a family, people have frequently made connections where I can post something. My name is Sharon Leslie, and I'm looking for Tom Leslie, born 1850 in Alabama. And then people will jump in and try to help you. And that's free. You don't have to be, you just have to join the page.
How do you, like, if you have the last name Smith, and it's very common, how do you research that, even though you did the ancestry DNA?
What, you have a surname that is very common?
Yes, Smith.
No, so honey. It's really difficult. But what you do is when you get the root community, like if you can get your again, I'm harking to African-American research, but this kind of works everywhere, is that you go to your home community and you read every page of that community and you see who you find there. And you will find neighbors, you'll find other people with that same surname, and it will help give you a community picture that that is better than what you get if by just pulling up a result on ancestry.com or on familysearch.com. If you pull up one person, you don't get the whole picture. So the whole picture is by reading the entire census.
Yes.
And it is really tedious, but it is really useful. Because if you find your ancestor like in 1870 and you look at the people living next door to them, you will often find cousins, children, you know, other people who are related. You will often find the former slaveholder. So you got to read the whole thing, all of the individual pages.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Yes,
We got some questions online.
Okay, Tom,
So-
you're gonna have to read those to me because when I pulled it up, I didn't see them.
There are some
Well-
hands raised as well.
Yeah, there was Sandra Kraft and SRMCC that had some questions. So I'll let them come off mute and ask you those questions directly.
Okay.
okay, oh shucks. Dog it. Okay, here we here I am, okay. I'm SRMCC. I was just wondering, can you re-show that last page with the books, the suggested reading, please?
Hopefully. Okay, come on. Yes, there you go. You see it?
Yeah, yes, I see it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Sandra Kraft. The question that I have, so I'm doing my son's genealogy, and I've gotten all the way back to like his 5th or 6th great grandfather. And it's the 1870 census. And that person, he is Thaddeus Felix. And on the census, his mother is actually living in the house. So I've got another generation. The place of birth, whoever took the census said unknown. However, for Thaddeus's father, it says his place of birth was Africa. So I'm trying to figure out, because I'm at that point where now I found that African ancestor. How do I'm trying, because I guess apparently he's dead. But where do I go to find where he may be? I don't know who the slave owner is, and given what you just said, I'll go back and look and see if I can find some white Felixes. But I want to also try to locate like the slave ship. So I'm wondering if I should look in the area where they're living now and see maybe what ships came into that area. What do you recommend?
Where is this?
This is in Mississippi.
Okay, there are two things you can do for that. Where exactly in Mississippi? Give me a county.
I don't know. I mean, I don't have it right off the top
Okay,
of my
well, there
head.
are
Yeah.
two things that you can do. There is a transatlantic slave database.
Okay.
What it does is it documents voyages from Africa. The problem with it is that when people entered the slave ships, they had African names.
Mhm.
When they exited on this side, they probably had American names. So it is a problem. But if you will often find somebody, like I have an ancestor whose name is Friday. So the naming system for West Africa is that his name would have been the African name for Friday. And right now my brain is not going to tell me what that name is. But the transatlantic slave is called Transatlantic Slave Voyages Database. Just Google that in and you can look there and that may give you a start.
And I was
Another
also,
thing-
well, and I was also wondering if there would be records on the American side of who was actually purchasing slaves, I guess is more what I'm looking for, to run down the list of white men who were actually at those auctions. And if I run across one whose name is Felix, then that might kind of be a place to start as well. What do you think
No,
about that?
there's nothing that says who was at the auctions.
Okay.
However, here's another resource. There is a listing of, because you're dealing with Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
Louisiana slave manifests.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is they document the domestic slave trade. So people who were shipped to Louisiana were often named. So the way the database is made is that you can look for the name of a slaveholder, like
Mhm.
you type in Felix, and
Mhm.
see if you shipped anybody to Louisiana. Because what happened was that they shipped people to Louisiana and then they brought them up to Mississippi.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I put links to both of those in the chat. So the slavevoyages.org and then
Yes.
the Louisiana Slave Manifest of Coastwise Vessels. That's a searchable collection on Family Search that you can
Yes.
check
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you,
So,
sir. Thank you.
Is that it? Is that the end of the
There was
question?
another
One more?
question that was in the chat that was asked by Brent a little earlier about contacting enslaver descendants. So you've had some very unique experiences getting in contact with the descendants of your family's own, slaveholders. How do we do that today? How do you approach those folks?
Tenderly. If you go to comingtoTheTable.org, there is advice there for how you approach this. Coming to the Table is a community of people who are descendants of enslaved people and descendants of people whose ancestors were the enslavers. And the whole point is that making the connection is a healing act. Everybody is not interested in that, and everybody is obviously not in coming to the table. But it should be done And you have to approach it sometimes gingerly. Even in discovering my own personal, I know we're related. I have had people where I've initially communicated with them and they're like, oh, hell no. So I had one where I found them online and I reached out and it's like, we must be related because I'm looking at your family tree. So obviously we are related and I have all this information. And they sent a message back that's like, no, we can't be related. And so that's not happening. But they were kind enough to send me all the information that they had, to this little Black person who was looking. And it ended up that we actually really were related. And it was shocking to them. Because when they sent me their Black information, it's like, ta-da, well, here's your name that fits under this name that you sent me. So you're Black too. And it was very interesting. So you have to be very conscious about how you approach people, and you must do it in a courteous and kind and open-minded way. Some people will be fine with it and others will absolutely shut you down. So it all depends.
Are there any other questions online or in the room?
Last question from online. Sharon, why aren't you angry about all this? You said you've talked about how you used to be, but what process of healing, your presentation is healing from, historical harm. How have you healed?
Well, there are two things, both of them are quotes. One of them is that first it hurts and then it heals. The other one is Alice Walker. You have to go back to where the wound was made. So when you revisit the history and you look at it in a truthful way, you are able to transform. I was really angry. So many horrible things happened that really pissed me off. And I had to step back, gather myself together, and deal with it. So you can either spend your energy being angry or you can spend your energy doing something productive. So I channel all the rage that I used to feel into doing productive things. So now I am where the wound was made in Bush, Mississippi. And I have walked my ancestors' footsteps. I am writing this book. And I am channeling my rage into something productive. I'm involved with the Historical Society, and I am opening people's minds here about broadening their perspective on history. And that is far more useful and productive than sitting around being angry.
Hey, any more questions? Thank you very much, Cheryl. I think it was a very lively presentation.
I'm glad. I hope that it was useful to everyone. I urge you to, if you're on Facebook, go to the Our Black Ancestry Facebook page. If you want to become a member of the website where I have all the resources, I would welcome you to do that. And I think that in the final analysis, if we're ever going to change the system under which we live so that racism is not the defining factor, that we are all Americans, we are all human beings, and we need to treat each other with respect and humanity. And we're just all people, and we are flawed, and we are, if you have a good heart, you will want to do something better. And I want to see a society that is better. I want it to be equitable. I want it to be fair for everybody. So I hope that by doing your family research, that will lead you to that same conclusion.
Thank you very much, Sharon.
Okay, am I signing off now? I don't see the sign off button. But go well, everyone. Let's see. Okay.